So I guess welcome to day two. What we left off yesterday, we talked briefly, so we kind of went ahead. We skipped these couple of slides and we went ahead and talked about the session. And we talked about how the sessions are used on Tomcat and how they're part of the Java servlet spec, and they're guaranteed to always be there. So let's come back here, just kind of finish what we skipped, and then we're gonna go and wrap up the whole servlet and web, basic web development stuff, and also cover quickly the JSP stuff so we can get started with our project. So first and foremost, serving a single request with multiple resources. This is something I actually wanted to touch base on. This is one of those things. It's not necessarily super easy for me to explain simply because until you see the need for it, you won't really understand why the heck do we care about it. But let me show you a simple application, a very trivial application that uses this idea of serving a single request, but you employing multiple resources. And when I say multiple resources, it can be static files and servlets being used at the same time, or it can be, for example, multiple servlets being used at the same time, or a servlet and a JSP used at the same time. Although we haven't seen JSP, so that part will come in a little later. The whole processing of what we're going to talk about is accomplished using something called the request dispatcher. But let's take a look at what that is. Okay, so here I have a little application. So let me first of all close all these files. So close all. Open up this application and let's take a look at this. So it's an application that basically acts as a little kind of portal. Okay, it's actually stupid. It's not all that exciting. But let me actually deploy it, maybe just to show you what it looks like, and then we're gonna deploy it. So I have a little server portal example. I'm just gonna stick it. Whoops, I guess this doesn't quite work that way. So I'm gonna copy it from here. So I have a WAR file. Whoops. Let me get this out of the way. Server portal example. So copy the work file, go to Tomcat web apps. This application was written a long time ago, so it's not actually created as a dynamic web project. It works slightly differently and uses AND to be compiled. It's not a big deal. But anyway, let me just explain to you the usage of the application, and then I'll show you the the actual logic, which is what I wanted to explain in the first place. So, okay, why are you not being deployed? Just one second. Servlet portal example. That is odd. Let's copy this again. Or maybe I killed one. Oh, so I have to actually go to one of the URLs. That's probably why. So let's go to a URL 1.html. Okay, that's fine. Cool. Okay, so ignoring the fact that I can actually go to the 1.html. So here I'm actually, this application implements a little login system whereby in order for me to access some content, I'm supposed to log in. Well, if I can't log in, I have to first register. So I register by clicking on this little register .html. I go and enter my information like I'm registering as Sasha with password ABC123. I click on register. I'm now registered. I click on login. I can now log in with Sasha ABC123, and I'm logged in, and now I can access, quote unquote, secure content 1, 2, 3. So this is just some stupid pages, and whoops, and this was just cached. And now I can click on log out, and when I'm logged out, I can't actually go back to, for example, if I click on 1 and refresh, it forces me back to the login page. I mean, it's really, really dumb. Okay, there's not much to it, but I just wanted to explain a few concepts with respect to serving multiple requests, with a single resource. So here's a a servlet called Secure Servlet, and what this servlet is supposed to do, it basically, and again, nothing too exciting, it goes and checks for in the session, okay, whether I have some kind of an attribute called login, and that attribute login is really just some kind of a string called login flag. It's kind of like a, a token in my session. Do I have it or not? If I don't have it, here's basically what happens. Rather than this servlet knowing how to log me in or how to even send me to the login page, what it does, it actually goes and loads something called login.html as basically some kind of content, and it's really nothing more than static content. So it exists right here under static. So here it is, login.html, and then it says I'm going to forward this request and the response to this page. So what's going on is that at this point, this servlet effectively relinquishes control of handling that request, and the actual response comes by whichever servlet is able to handle this URL. And we don't have a servlet that knows how to handle this URL. What happens is that that default servlet that I mentioned yesterday, the one that serves all static content for all applications on Tomcat, that servlet kicks in and literally just goes and gives us that page, that HTML. Okay? So this is an example of us forwarding a request from one place to another. Yesterday we said servlets handle the requests, right? They're the ultimate, handler of every request, but that may not always be the case. It's very possible for a servlet to delegate the request to something else. Here, on the other hand, if that login flag exists, we basically go and print a little bit of HTML, okay, some junk in there. We then go and get something, again, a request dispatcher, but this time over something called navbar. Now navbar doesn't exist as a file here. See that? There's no navbar.html or just navbar. What navbar is, it's a little, it's a stupid little servlet, which is mapped right here. So navbar, okay, to a servlet called navigation, and navigation servlet is something called navigation servlet. So what's going on is that we're now getting that navigation servlet, and then we are including the response of the navigation servlet within our own response. So here what we see is the secure servlet is rendering a little bit of content, and then it's asking another servlet to start do its own job. This other servlet, navbar, really just goes and does the following. It just goes and prints, literally, some kind of HTML table that includes the links to 1, 2, 3 and log out. Okay? Nothing too exciting about it, right? I mean, it's just HTML. I mean, it has, it knows a little bit about who I'm logged in as and whatever, but it's ultimately just print some HTML. But what's interesting here is that this servlet goes and basically, so secure servlet includes asks another servlet to step in to do one part of the request.
I didn't quite get what's the difference between include and
So in the case of a forward, we do not actually, we're not supposed to continue running after the forward. That means that we effectively are relinquishing our control to handle that request. We now are giving that request to another servlet. In this case, it's just a static page, which happens to be the default servlet. So we're having another servlet do the job instead of us. And we are not, so when this comes back, because this is just a method call, when this comes back, we're not supposed to do anything else to the response. Okay, so we know that other servlet hopefully took care of the request. It's possible that other servlet in turn forwarded somewhere else, but we are no longer responsible for handling that request. Well, the default servlet is basically a servlet when I go, for example, to a page like localhost 8080, and then I say tomcat.gif. Okay. So this is a file that exists in the root application of Tomcat. Remember, the root application has no name. So let me just close this. Has no name, right? So I don't have to say root. And this file, so exists right here, tomcat.gif. See, if I open up the web.xml file here, right? If I open up this file, you'll notice there's no servlet definition for tomcat.gif, right? So how does this work? Well, what happens is that there's a servlet that's defined in another web.xml file, which is inside of the Tomcat's conf directory, which is in this web XML, which is really, really long. It's a 53 kilobyte file. And this servlet, called the default servlet, right here, it happens to be mapped. Let me just show you to what it's mapped to. It's going to be over here. The default servlet gets mapped to a URL pattern, which is just slash. And what happens is that default servlet effectively maps to every request. So, but because Tomcat and all Java EE application servers or servlet containers look at the more specific mapping first, any of our servlets will win if they map to anything that matches the request. But if they don't, like in our case, like in this case, for example, coming back, there was no mapping for the tomcat.gif. The default servlet comes in and says, oh, I'll handle it. And it goes and reads tomcat.gif and sends it back to us as a binary file. So coming back here, sharing data across multiple servlets or across these servlets. Just one thing I wanted to mention, and you guys probably saw that yesterday. In the servlet, let's say I wanted to pass to the navigation servlet, who you are, like who you're logged in as. Right? So I want to, in the secure servlet, tell the navigation servlet something about you. Right? And I know that based on the fact that I got your login stuff from the session. Right? So I can actually grab this over here, put it over here, say string, user equals this, and then say if user equals to null, blah, blah, blah. And here what I can do is I can say, I want to give to this navbar servlet your name. Right? Your login name. So the way I will do that, obviously this needs to be casted to a string because this gives us an object. So the way I will do that is I can actually simply go and say rec.setAttribute, for example, username, and the value is user, or I should just say user. Okay? The idea is that I can stick into the request object any kind of data that I want, but because the request object gets shared across all these servlets, whatever I put in the request object as an attribute, the other servlets down the stream can get that same attribute from the same request object in order to get my data. Right? So because ultimately, like I said before, this is the only way to share data across. For one servlet to invoke another servlet, right? This requires dispatcher forwarder included. This is the only way we have at our disposal. Well, how do we pass arguments from one servlet to another servlet? Well, it's via the request object, and this is basically the example of us doing that. Now, it's somewhat redundant because the same information we're putting in the request object actually happens to be available in the session scope. So it's kind of like, why are we doing it? But I just wanted to show you, that it's possible. And in fact, later on, when we do the model view controller, the model is what you will be putting into the request object at the servlet level so that the view can access it via the request object. So this idea of sharing data through the request object, which also happens to be known as a request scope, is extremely important. Okay, so how would I then use this is I can go to a navigation servlet and I can say, okay, you're logged in as, and rather than do this long blah, 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 I just go and say get attribute and I say user, right? And of course, I'm assuming that this exists and I'm assuming that the user, whatever I get, is something, of a particular type that makes sense for my, particular application or a particular servlet, but this should work. Okay, I'm not saying this is the best way to do it. It's somewhat redundant because we work even without this, but at least it gives you an idea of how this would work.
Actually, I have a question. So the threading, each user will have one thread, right, per request?
Each request will have a thread. In fact, better yet, each connection will have a thread. But usually, you're supposed to assume that one request equals one connection. So yes.
Okay, so the request object, you get request object per thread, right?
Sure. The request object is single-threaded because it's basically only one thread can access it at any given time, assuming you don't leak it to other threads.
Okay. I'm just wondering about like synchronizing when you set the request, like if it's being shared.
Well,
Then
again, it's not. So it's shared within the context of a single thread, right? So at this time, our single secure servlet runs, and only our single secure servlet has access to the request object. Once we do a forward over here to the navbar servlet, we no longer run. I mean, it's a synchronous call. We're making effectively a method call to something else. Now the navigation servlet runs, and it can go and read something, read and write to the request, and it know that no one else can modify it. So it is it's safe. That's not necessarily the case with a session, because it is possible for a session to be modified concurrently, right? So you have to be somewhat cautious with session changes. Like for example, that servlet that we built, the one that counts the number of times we visited a page. Well, it's possible actually for two concurrent requests to hit the same servlet, and because we're not doing the counting in a thread-safe way, it's actually possible for us to lose count, right? So you have to be careful about it. Now, generally, 99.9% of the time, its sessions could be considered thread-safe, just because unless you use things like, for example, frames, right, which most sites don't use, chances of concurrent requests with exactly the same session are fairly low. At least it ultimately depends on how you build your sites. Okay, but for ultimate thread safety, you could potentially want also verify concurrent requests to the session.
So in case of forward,
So
the thread controls that thread is being passed, right? The same thread is
right. Well,
this
again, this method is being invoked by some kind of a thread. When we go and make a call here to include the navbar, we are making that method call. We relinquish that. It's not like we continue running in parallel while this other servlet runs. This is synchronous call. We are making that call.
Right.
So it's in the very same thread.
whether include or forward, right?
But it doesn't matter. Exactly. So neither include nor forward are basically multi-threaded. So it's not like this is going to do like an immediate return and dispatch the processing in another thread. That does not happen. So both include and forward are synchronous operations. There's just standard method calls.
How many simultaneous threads Tomcat?
As many as you configure. By default, actually, Tomcat, for some stupid reason, recently they haven't actually been configuring them explicitly. But in the Apache Tomcat conf server.xml file, there's something called a connector, and this connector, it's right here. And the default is, it doesn't say, but the default is 200. So there's currently maximum 200 threads on this particular connector. But again, that is simply a matter of me just saying max threads equals 300, 500, 1,000. So it's a a system administration's question, not something that you have to worry about. But it's a fair question. But it's something, again, it's an implementation detail.
Just one simple question. Can I, in my parent servlet, can I start output? I mean, like I set the content type, get the output stream, start output something, and then redirect, or it's not allowed? I would have to either redirect or...
Right. So first of all, does anyone here understand what a redirect is? Does anyone not here? Does anyone here not understand what a redirect is? Okay, how do you implement a redirect?
Send it 304.
304, yeah.
No, 304 is not a redirect.
If this,
Sorry?
305.
No.
I don't know how to do it.
So 304 is actually not modified. So that just means the content hasn't been modified. That's when a server goes and says, it looks at a header called if modify since, and that's a date header, checks for the content versus the date, and then it either returns a 200, which says here's the new content because it's been modified, or returns a 304 in case it hasn't been modified. A 301 is a permanent redirect. A 302 is a temporary redirect. The only way you can change either 301 or 302, which are basically these things, is if you don't have anything committed. Remember we talked about it yesterday. So if you start writing to the output and you pass the threshold of that buffer and your response gets committed, well then that's it. You cannot affect the headers anymore, and this is the first and most important header. So the answer is no, you cannot do a redirect after you've already written content to the output stream, unless it's it's not been buffered yet, or unless it's still in the buffered mode, and you should not assume that. Any other questions? Okay, so let's take a look. So does this make sense? Just the fact that the request object is in a sense just like in addition to having all this other stuff, it's also like a hash map, right? Effectively, you can store arbitrary stuff in the request object. It has a set attribute and get attribute and remove attribute, and you can also get all attributes, whether by names or whatever, just by values. And the attribute is anything, any object. It's literally like a hash map. Like underneath the cover, there's probably some kind of a hash map. Okay? So we'll talk more about this later because this is going to be important for MVC. It's the cornerstone of how MVC works. We already discussed the maintaining client state. So this is basically the so-called session state scope, and we already saw how we use it. And the same methods like set attribute, get attribute, remove attribute are that exist at the request object exist at the session object, right? Pretty much the same thing. We already talked briefly about session configuration. You asked me about how do you change the timeout, and this is an explanation of how you do that. Now the other thing.
Sorry, where do we change the timeout?
This is in the web.xml file. So in fact, we actually saw it here yesterday. So in the this at the very end, I changed the session timeout. So I said session config 60 minutes. And this is, like I said yesterday, this is one of the rare units that's in minutes. And again, this is in the deployment descriptor. The default timeout is 30 minutes, and that is set in that default web.xml file, the one in the conf directory of Catalina, of Tomcat. And it's 30 minutes. So if you don't say otherwise, it's going to be 30 minutes.
So if I need to change it once after deployment, that means I have to rebuild the WAR file too.
Sure, or you're deploying, if your application, if whoever's deploying this is basically deploying it. Sorry?
They can edit the.
Sure, well, they may not deploy it as a WAR file to begin with, so they can just edit the web.xml file directly. There's also another way of changing this via something called a context file, but we'll see that later. Actually, examples of that later once we see our project.
I'm asking because in the past in our environment, from one environment to the other, session type. This figure needed to be changed. So every time people were dependent on somebody. Of course, I was just a third person. I was not involved in that, but I was thinking, what is the quickest way to do it? Because we are just in the development mode, and
well, they could
I
didn't even know. So the one way is not to have it here, and then depending on what kind of applications your server is hosting is, you could actually just go and have to change this file right here, the Tomcat's conf file, right? So change the default. So that will apply to all applications. So in this file, if you scroll down long enough, it's right here, 30 minutes. So you can go and edit this file and change it right here, and then that's server specific, not app specific. Now, of course, if you want it to actually be for one application, then you can create something called a context file, and then the context file would live outside of the WAR file, but it would be app specific, and that file would live in a directory called conf engine name, which is Catalina / host name, which is localhost, and then you would create a file, for example, that would, if your application was called blah, you would have a file called blah.xml, and there you would define the session timeouts through something called a manager, XML element. But again, that's more of an implementation detail. So,
I have one question.
Go ahead.
How do you handle session expiration while a request is in the process?
It doesn't get expired while the request is in the process. So
Session level, even if you've expired your 30 minutes and the request is still taking longer than 30 minutes.
So, well, if the request is taking longer than 30 minutes, you have other things to worry about. But yeah, maybe like a request takes place like just, you know, 29 seconds before or something like that. But the start of the request is basically checked against, you know, the whatever the session timeout. I mean, it's possible that different application servers may look at this differently. Generally, though, session timeouts are not actually that strict. So what happens is that it's not like exactly on 30-minute mark your session is going to expire. What really happens, depending on how your sessions are managed, because your sessions may actually be stored on some, you know, other storage somewhere. So it's possible that, you know, some kind of a background thread runs ever so often and checks for when sessions should be removed from memory, and that's what actually expires the sessions. And that thread may run every, you know, 10 seconds, 50 seconds, 2 minutes, God, you know, who knows. And of course, if the session is currently, you know, attached to a request, that thread will most likely not expire. So in general, it's never been a problem. How exactly it's implemented at the level of the application server, I've never looked at that code, but not something you have to worry about.
So essentially, it is set an attribute into a session. You don't really have to worry about whether the session expired, and you will not get that attribute.
That's true. That's true. So within a single request, you know, if you maintain, you know, as long as that request is in flight, I've never seen a situation where a session would expire. You know, like at the beginning of the request, the session was there. At the end of the request, it wasn't. So if that happened, that would be a bug of the application server that we're using.
I had a question here. The session attributes you can actually put in. You can set up session attributes. I did not see anywhere where a new request comes by, and how do you search it against a given session? How do you search the session?
You don't, well, first of all, you don't search the session. You know, like, so for example, right here, you know, when someone logs in, so here's a login servlet, right? Someone goes and says, okay, I want to log in. This login servlet goes and checks for my username and password, verifies that I exist, and it goes and adds to the session my flag, you know, that I'm logged in. So now my secure servlet, so this is where I record the fact that I'm logged in. And now my stupid little secure servlet goes and basically says, hey, give me your username. I mean, I'm not searching the session. I'm going to a session like a hash map, and I'm saying, give me some attribute. Right? It's not like, I mean, you know, session may have like get all attributes. In fact, the info servlet will show you that it does. But it's not, you don't search it. I mean, you built it. You know exactly what, you know what you put in, so you know what you can get back. Okay? So, shared application data. Let me just mention this because this is also important. So what's also possible, what's also interesting is that while we can store information in the request object, which only lives for the duration of one request, we can store stuff in the session object, which lives for as long as that session is still not expired. We can also store data, random data, in something called a servlet context object, which is also referred to as application scope, which basically means it's the area of memory that is not tied to a request or a session, it's tied to the application. So whatever you put in there will live in there until you either remove it or until the application is shut down. Okay? So an example of that is actually the registration servlet. What happens is that, let me just show you very quickly. How does my application even know who's logged in and who's registered? How do I know whether I'm a legit user when I try to log in, right? So what happens is that this registration servlet goes and in the init method goes and gets something called a servlet context. A servlet context is an object that is shared across all servlets in a given application. But every application has a unique servlet context. And guess what? A servlet context also has a set attribute whereby you can go and set an attribute, like for example, in this case, something called users, which is just a string, right? It says user-map, and you put, like for example, a hash map. And then what happens is that when somebody registers, what do? I simply go and grab from the servlet context. Again, I just access it like this. I grab from the servlet context that something by that name, I know I get back a map, of course, because it's just an object, I have to cast it. And then because I want to make sure that multiple simultaneous registrations don't override this map, and I'm just using a hash map, I'm not using a hash table, I have to wrap it and synchronize. So now I can go and say, well, if you already exist, you're a duplicate. Otherwise, I put you in the map, and then I say successful registration, and then I forward to one or the other. Right? So I mean, it's very, very simple. It's this, the same get attribute and set attribute that you saw that exists at the request scope exists at the session scope and now exists at a servlet context. The only thing is servlet context is shared across all servlets. Does that make sense?
So this code that you have in it, is it thread safe? I mean, do we have a
Yes.
guarantee that
There's this method. This method gets called once and only once. If this servlet is only configured once and only once in the web.xml
But I'm
file.
saying if there's another servlet which has similar code, right, then it's accessing the context object and might overwrite the, the attribute that we're trying to write here. So do we
Okay.
have to defend against multiple servlets being called init concurrently?
So no, so multiple servlets cannot call init concurrently. Servlets are always initialized sequentially, by the application by Tomcat, if they have the load and startup set to true. What's going on though is that what can happen is that if this servlet wasn't, for example, loaded, and some other servlet was loaded, and another servlet went and put in something into the servlet context with this name, and then this servlet was initialized because it was its first request, it could potentially overwrite what's in the servlet context. Now, servlet context itself, like doing the set attribute on the servlet context, is thread safe, but you potentially can destroy something that already exists there, right? But that's kind of, you need to understand that, based on how you're writing your application.
Isn't that equivalent to a static?
You could, yes. So in a sense, you could, as opposed to using a servlet context, use something like a static. But static basically it sucks for all.
It's something equivalent.
It's kind of exactly. So it's basically persistent, for the lifetime of the application, effectively. So it's kind of like as if you use static, as if I basically declare this hash map as a static. The benefit of not using static though is, in addition to all the other problems with static like testing and so on, is that you basically the servlet context is by default shared across all servlets in a given application. So basically, the advantage is that the servlet context is a singleton by its nature, right? And it's always available to anything. So you don't have to worry about how you don't have to create a singleton object and access it that way. Okay. So does this make sense? Okay. Initializing applications. This is worth mentioning, although not that exciting, I guess, is that applications also can be initialized as a whole. So you'll see examples of this, especially later when we configure Spring. Basically, there's just like servlets can have those init params, applications can have context params. So a context param you can actually access by getting a servlet context and then saying get init param. So you're getting an init param of the context, which is effectively of the application. So if you ever need to go and effectively get some kind of a parameter that it's not unique to a particular servlet, right? If it's something that's like global for your application and you want it to be in the web.xml file as opposed to some kind of proprietary file, you can just put it as a context param and then read it from the servlet context. Okay. Other than that, there's no. There are examples of code you can take a look at, but it's not all that exciting. Thread safety, we already discussed it, so I don't want to go and go into more details. Basically, thread safety, you just have to worry about thread safety, when you're accessing shared objects, whether they're in application scope, whether potentially they're in a session scope, or whether they're static objects, or whether they're, not even static. Like for example, each servlet gets loaded once and only once. So if it has any kind of state that is, not thread safe, you have to worry about it. Right? That's why generally most servlets are made to be stateless. Sending binary responses. Let me mention that so we can wrap up with the servlet stuff. We talked about it briefly yesterday. and you asked me about setting binary responses, so let's take a look at that. So over here, back in the servlet examples application, we have here a servlet called flag servlet. And what this does, it's a very stupid little servlet, not very, very exciting, but let me show you. And it's actually not very thread safe, but that's a different story. It goes and builds a random object, and it creates a private file array, right? So that's its state. In the init method, it goes and basically gets an init parameter called dir, and then converts the dir to a real path. And then what it does, it basically creates a directory out of that path, and then literally asks the directory to list all files in that path that are files and end with extension .gif. So what happens is that basically this particular servlet is initialized, let me just show you, is initialized over here, flag servlet, okay, right here, and it says dir is /flags. So that /flags refers to effectively this directory flags, which has all your different flags. Okay? So effectively, by the time this flag servlet is initialized, this file array will have been pre-populated to list effectively all the files in that directory. Okay? And so the do get, what it does is it goes and grabs some random file from this array using this, next int random, whatever, just saying this random.nextInt for the length of the array. Now, the reason why I said this is not very thread safe, well, there are two problems. One is, first of all, I'm assuming that these flags don't get changed because it's possible someone goes and deletes a file. So by the time this gets called, what if one of the files doesn't exist anymore? So that's one thing that potentially you have to worry about. And the second problem is that the random object is actually not thread safe either. But for how I'm using it, it's good enough. Who cares if it's not truly random, right? But in general, you want to be careful with how you're using, state that's not thread safe. And if you do read the documentation on random, it will tell you that it's not a thread safe object. So it says somewhere here, blah, blah, blah. Somewhere here it says that it's not thread safe. Doesn't matter. Okay, so anyway, here's basically where it becomes interesting. I go and grab a file input stream over the file. I set the content length to the file length. You asked me about content length yesterday. So here's an example of how you set it. Of course, the file length is in long, and this is expecting an int, so you have to be careful about the conversion. So as long as it's not more than gigabytes, you're safe. And then I set a content type, so I don't want my browsers to struggle to figure out what kind of type data I'm sending back. So in general, you will not be writing code like this, but if you were to, like for example, let's say you guys from Semantic, you're sending some kind of virus definition file, and there's a content type for it. Well, it makes sense to go and tell the world, your client that that's what they're receiving, as opposed to maybe some kind of an error, which is maybe in text or XML response or something like that can be displayed to the user. Like if the user hasn't paid or renewed their subscription, they're going to get some kind of an XML file that says, hey, go here to renew your subscription. Otherwise, they get the binary content, right? The client side can determine that based on the content type, as an example. Okay, and then here I don't want this to be cached. So here's an example of me setting an explicit header. I don't want the browser to cache this, or the client, right? Because it's a random file. I want it to renew every single time, right? To get it again every single time. And then I, in this case, don't get a writer, I get an output stream. I build a little buffer. I go and read read from the input stream right to the output stream. I close. I flush everything, and I close the input stream, and I'm done. Okay, so the only missing part is how do I actually map this. So how this works is that I take this flag servlet, which was where is my flag servlet again? I'm blind. Somewhere in here, so flag servlet, and the way I map it is I basically go and say my flag servlet is anything that is a /flag.gif. Right? Now notice there's no file /flag.gif anywhere inside of this. There's no flag.gif. It's a virtual, I invented that URL. It's a pseudo URL, right? But nevertheless, if I go to my little browser, I can go and say servlet examples flag.gif, And if I go and do this, every time I'm going to get a different flag. And it's a random flag, I don't even know which one I'm going to get. Does that make sense? And I mean, just simple example of, doing binary. Oh, there we go. We had the American flag for a while. I'm Canadian, actually, so I'll leave this one out. So anyway, let me just kill this. So does this make sense?
So this is more of an HTTP question, but what's the semantic of the content link attribute of the header? Like, how is that actually useful? Or
Yes. Remember yesterday I mentioned, like, let's say you're downloading like a super long file, and your browser asks you where do you want to save it, and you say here, and you hit save, and then you get a little progress bar that says, oh, this is how much you saved, this is how much time you have left based on what we've seen so far. If there was no content length, you would not know how long it would take to download that file.
But it's not a guarantee, right? It's just an estimate.
Well, it's
we
possible
can fail at any time, right?
Yes, that's true, and it's also possible for the client, for the server to go over the content length or under the content length and close, and then the browser will have to contend to deal with that, to the fact that it may not have all the content, for example. And different browsers may behave differently. So in general, you don't want to find out how they will behave. You want it to conform to the specs. So you either set the content length and then you deliver that much content, and if you don't, you should assume that the browser either disregarded it or reported as an error, and then you expect another request for the same file, for example. Or you don't set the content length, in which case the browser is going to keep on reading until the stream is closed, or it reaches the end of stream.
But the browser should probably do that anyways, right? I mean, regardless.
It may or may not, but whether it should or whether it does, it's a different question. Okay. So anyway, does this make sense? Any questions with binary stuff? Okay, cool. So just to wrap up, so this was the standing binary response. Handling file uploads, we actually, so servlet spec doesn't, at least up until 2.5, I'm not sure, I can't remember if 3.0 actually finally includes it, but there was no explicit support for file upload. And so what you would do is you would use something like Apache Commons file upload library, and there are actually a few other open source ones. This shows you an example of how you would use Apache Commons. And the way this would work is you would need to have a form that would be multi-part encoded, so multi-part / form-data encoded, and then you would basically, someone would hit upload a file. You would need to configure explicit filter. We'll talk about filters in a moment, and that filter would catch that request, and it will take the request object and it would convert it into this kind of multi-part request object. And then once you can test for whether something is a multi-part request object, like over here. So here's an example of how you can test for it. You simply say, hey, is this a multiple request content? This servlet file upload is something that comes from the Jakarta Commons upload library. If that's true, then you go and, for example, build some disk file item library. You build some whatever, handle this upload. You get a list of your files. You get the next file. You check for whether you get the file name. You can get the, I don't even know what a phone. So this is a field name. So it's just for fields as opposed to files. And then here you can get the file name. You can get the size. You can see whether the file is already in memory. If it is, you can even get its bytes. Otherwise, the file might have been already stored in some kind of a temporary storage of the server, and then you can get input stream, and then you can do something with the input stream, like save it to somewhere. Okay. So, anyways, this is just a simple recipe. It's maybe not that simple, but it's fairly straightforward recipe for how you would handle file uploads. Spring MVC has even a simpler way of doing this because it wraps this for you and abstracts it away. So when we talk about Spring MVC, if we have the time, we'll actually take a look at that as well. Okay. Welcome file list we already discussed, so I don't want to go over it again. The error documents, this is just worth mentioning very quickly.